This video is for educational purposes. This is the continuation of the part 1 of the history of America. In this channel, this serves as part 2. Common people became insurgents against the British even though they were unfamiliar with the ideological rationales being offered. They held very strongly a sense of rights that they felt the British were deliberately violating, rights that stressed local autonomy, fair dealing, and government by consent. They were highly sensitive to the issue of tyranny, which they saw manifested by the arrival in Boston of the British Army to punish the Bostonians. This heightened their sense of violated rights, leading to rage and demands for revenge, and they had faith that God was on their side. The Second Continental Congress voted to declare independence on July 2, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence was drafted by the Committee of Five. The Declaration of Independence presented arguments in favor of the rights of citizens, stating that all men are created equal, supporting the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and demanding the consent of the governed. It also listed grievances against the Crown. The Founding Fathers were guided by the ideology of republicanism, rejecting the monarchism of Great Britain. The Declaration of Independence was signed by members of the Congress on July 4. This date has since been commemorated as Independence Day. The American Revolutionary War began with the battles of Lexington and Concord when American and British forces clashed on April 19, 1775. George Washington was appointed General of the Continental Army. The New York and New Jersey campaign was the first major campaign of the war, beginning in 1776. Washington's crossing of the Delaware River began a series of victories that expelled British forces from New Jersey. The British began the Saratoga campaign in 1777 to capture Albany, New York as a choke point. After American victory at Saratoga, France, the Netherlands, and Spain began providing support to the Continental Army. Britain responded to defeat in the Northern Theater by advancing in the Southern Theater, beginning with the capture of Savannah in 1778. American forces reclaimed the South in 1781, and the British Army was defeated in the Siege of Yorktown on October 19, 1781. King George III formally ordered the end of hostilities on December 5, 1782, recognizing American independence. The Treaty of Paris was negotiated between Great Britain and the United States to establish terms of peace. It was signed on September 3, 1783, and it was ratified by the Congress of the Confederation on January 14, 1784. Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army on December 23, 1783. The Articles of Confederation were ratified as the governing law of the United States, written to limit the powers of the central government in favor of state governments. This caused economic decline, as the government was unable to pass economic legislation and pay its debts. Nationalists worried that the Confederate nature of the Union was too fragile to withstand an armed conflict with any adversarial states, or even internal revolts such as the Shays' Rebellion of 1786 in Massachusetts. In the 1780s, the national government was able to settle the issue of the western regions of the young United States, which were ceded by the states to Congress and became territories. With the migration of settlers to the Northwest, soon they became states. The American Indian Wars continued in the 1780s as settlers moved west, prompting Native American attacks on American civilians and in turn prompting American attacks on Native American civilians. The Northwestern Confederacy and American settlers began fighting the Northwest Indian War in the late 1780s. The Northwestern Confederacy received British support, but the settlers received little assistance from the American government. Nationalists, most of them war veterans, organized in every state and convinced Congress to call the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. The delegates from every state wrote a new constitution that created a federal government with a strong president and powers of taxation. The new government reflected the prevailing Republican ideals of guarantees of individual liberty and of constraining the power of government through a system of separation of powers. A national debate took place over whether the Constitution should be ratified, and it was ratified by a sufficient number of states in 1788 to begin forming a federal government. The United States Electoral College chose George Washington as the first President of the United States in 1789. George Washington, a renowned hero of the American Revolutionary War, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and President of the Constitutional Convention, became the first President of the United States under the new Constitution in 1789. The national capital moved from New York to Philadelphia in 1790 and finally settled in Washington, D.C. in 1800. The major accomplishment of the Washington administration was creating a strong national government that was recognized without question by all Americans. His government, following the vigorous leadership of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, assumed the debts of the states. The debt holders received federal bonds, created the Bank of the United States to stabilize the financial system, and set up a uniform system of tariffs, taxes on imports, and other taxes to pay off the debt and provide a financial infrastructure. To support his programs, Hamilton created a new political party, the first in the world based on voters, vague, the Federalist Party. To assuage the anti-federalists who feared a too powerful central government, the Congress adopted the United States Bill of Rights in 1791. Comprising the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, it guaranteed individual liberties such as freedom of speech and religious practice, jury trials, and stated that citizens and states had reserved rights, which were not specified. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison formed an opposition Republican Party, usually called the Democratic Republican Party by political scientists. Hamilton and Washington presented the country in 1794 with the Jay Treaty that re-established good relations with Britain. The Jeffersonians vehemently protested, and the voters aligned behind one party or the other, thus setting up the first party system. Federalists promoted business, financial and commercial interests and wanted more trade with Britain. Republicans accused the Federalists of plans to establish a monarchy, turn the rich into a ruling class, and making the United States a pawn of the British. The treaty passed, but politics became intensely heated. Serious challenges to the new federal government included the Northwest Indian War, the ongoing Cherokee-American Wars, and the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion, in which Western settlers protested against a federal tax on liquor. Washington called the state militia and personally led an army against the settlers, as the insurgents melted away and the power of the federal government was firmly established. Washington refused to serve more than 2 terms, setting a precedent, and in his famous farewell address, he extolled the benefits of federal government and importance of ethics and morality while warning against foreign alliances and the formation of political parties. John Adams, a Federalist, defeated Jefferson in the 1796 election. War loomed with France, and the Federalists used the opportunity to try to silence the Republicans with the Alien and Sedition Acts, build up a large army with Hamilton at the head, and prepare for a French invasion. However, the Federalists became divided after Adams sent a successful peace mission to France that ended the Quasi-War of 1798. During the first 2 decades after the Revolutionary War, there were dramatic changes in the status of slavery among the states and an increase in the number of freed blacks. Inspired by revolutionary ideals of the equality of men and influenced by their lesser economic reliance on slavery, northern states abolished slavery. States of the Upper South made manumission easier, resulting in an increase in the proportion of free blacks in the Upper South, as a percentage of the total non-white population, from less than 1% in 1792 to more than 10% by 1810. By that date, a total of 13.5% of all blacks in the United States were free. After that date, with the demand for slaves on the rise because of the Deep South's expanding cotton cultivation, the number of manumissions declined sharply, and an internal U.S. slave trade became an important source of wealth for many planters and traders. In 1807, with 4 million slaves already in the United States, Congress severed the U.S.'s involvement with the Atlantic slave trade. Jefferson defeated Adams massively for the presidency in the 1800 election. Jefferson's major achievement as president was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which provided U.S. settlers with vast potential for expansion west of the Mississippi River. Jefferson, a scientist, supported expeditions to explore and map the new domain, most notably the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson believed deeply in republicanism and argued it should be based on the independent yeoman farmer and planter. He distrusted cities, factories, and banks. He also distrusted the federal government and judges, and tried to weaken the judiciary. However, he met his match in John Marshall, a Federalist from Virginia. Although the Constitution specified a Supreme Court, its functions were vague until Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States, 1801 to 1835, defined them, especially the power to overturn acts of Congress or states that violated the Constitution, first enunciated in 1803 in Marbury v. Madison. Americans were increasingly angry at the British violation of American ships' neutral rights to hurt France, the impressment, seizure, of 10,000 American sailors needed by the Royal Navy to fight Napoleon, and British support for hostile Indians attacking American settlers in the American Midwest with the goal of creating a pro-British Indian barrier state to block American expansion westward. They may also have desired to annex all or part of British North America, although this is still heavily debated. Despite strong opposition from the Northeast, especially from Federalists who did not want to disrupt trade with Britain, Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. The war was frustrating for both sides. Both sides tried to invade the other and were repulsed. The American High Command remained incompetent until the last year. The American militia proved ineffective because the soldiers were reluctant to leave home and efforts to invade Canada repeatedly failed. The British blockade ruined American commerce, bankrupted the treasury, and further angered New Englanders, who smuggled supplies to Britain. The Americans under General William Henry Harrison finally gained naval control of Lake Erie and defeated the Indians under Tecumseh in Canada, while Andrew Jackson ended the Indian threat in the southeast. The Indian threat to expansion into the Midwest was permanently ended. The British invaded and occupied much of Maine. The British raided and burned Washington, but were repelled at Baltimore in 1814, where the Star-Spangled Banner was written to celebrate the American success. In upstate New York, a major British invasion of New York State was turned back at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Finally, in early 1815, Andrew Jackson decisively defeated a major British invasion at the Battle of New Orleans, making him the most famous war hero. With Napoleon, apparently, gone, the causes of the war had evaporated and both sides agreed to a peace that left the pre-war boundaries intact. Americans claimed victory on February 18, 1815, as news came almost simultaneously of Jackson's victory of New Orleans and the peace treaty that left the pre-war boundaries in place. Americans swelled with pride at success in the Second War of Independence. The naysayers of the anti-war Federalist Party were put to shame and the party never recovered. This helped lead to an emerging American identity that cemented national pride over state pride. Britain never achieved the war goal of granting the Indians a barrier state to block further American settlement, and this allowed settlers to pour into the Midwest without fear of a major threat. The War of 1812 also destroyed America's negative perception of a standing army, which was proved useful in many areas against the British as opposed to ill-equipped and poorly trained militias in the early months of the war, and War Department officials instead decided to place regular troops as the main military capabilities of the government. The Second Great Awakening was a Protestant revival movement that affected virtually all of society during the early 19th century and led to rapid church growth. The movement began around 1790, gained momentum by 1800, and, after 1820, membership rose rapidly among Baptist and Methodist congregations, whose preachers led the movement. It was past its peak by the 1840s. It enrolled millions of new members in existing evangelical denominations and led to the formation of new denominations. Many converts believed that the awakening heralded a new millennial age. The Second Great Awakening stimulated the establishment of many reform movements, including abolitionism and temperance, designed to remove the evils of society before the anticipated second coming of Jesus Christ. As strong opponents of the War of 1812, the Federalists held the Hartford Convention in 1814 that hinted at disunion. National euphoria after the victory at New Orleans ruined the prestige of the Federalists, and they no longer played a significant role as a political party. President Madison and most Republicans realized they were foolish to let the First Bank of the United States close down, for its absence greatly hindered the financing of the war. So, with the assistance of foreign bankers, they chartered the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. The Republicans also imposed tariffs designed to protect the infant industries that had been created when Britain was blockading the U.S. With the collapse of the Federalists as a party, the adoption of many Federalist principles by the Republicans, and the systematic policy of President James Monroe in his two terms, 1817 to 1825, to downplay partisanship, society entered an era of good feelings, with far less partisanship than before, or after, and closed out the first-party system. The Monroe Doctrine, expressed in 1823, proclaimed the United States opinion that European powers should no longer colonize or interfere in the Americas. This was a defining moment in the foreign policy of the United States. The Monroe Doctrine was adopted in response to American and British fears over Russian and French expansion into the Western Hemisphere. In 1832, President Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, ran for a second term under the slogan, "Jackson and No Bank," and did not renew the charter of the Second Bank, dissolving the bank in 1836. Jackson was convinced that central banking was used by the elite to take advantage of the average American, and instead implemented publicly owned banks in various states, popularly known as pet banks. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate treaties that exchanged Native American tribal lands in the eastern states for lands west of the Mississippi River. Its goal was primarily to remove Native Americans, including the 5 civilized tribes, from the American Southeast. They occupied land that settlers wanted. Jacksonian Democrats demanded the forcible removal of Native populations who refused to acknowledge state laws to reservations in the West. Whigs and religious leaders opposed the move as inhumane. Thousands of deaths resulted from the relocations, as seen in the Cherokee Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears resulted in approximately 2,000 to 8,000 of the 16,543 relocated Cherokee perishing along the way. Many of the Seminole Indians in Florida refused to move west. They fought the Army for years in the Seminole Wars. After the first party system of Federalists and Republicans withered away in the 1820s, the stage was set for the emergence of a new party system based on well-organized local parties that appealed for the votes of, almost, all adult white men. The former Jeffersonian, Democratic-Republican, party split into factions. They split over the choice of a successor to President James Monroe, and the party faction that supported many of the old Jeffersonian principles, led by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, became the Democratic Party. As Norton explains the transformation in 1828, Jacksonians believed the people's will had finally prevailed. Through a lavishly financed coalition of state parties, political leaders, and newspaper editors, a popular movement had elected the president. The Democrats became the nation's first well-organized national party, and tight party organization became the hallmark of 19th-century American politics. Opposing factions led by Henry Clay helped form the Whig Party. The Democratic Party had a small but decisive advantage over the Whigs until the 1850s, when the Whigs fell apart over the issue of slavery. The great majority of anti-slavery activists, such as Abraham Lincoln and Mr. Walters, rejected Garrison's theology and held that slavery was an unfortunate social evil, not a sin. The American colonies and the newly formed Union grew rapidly in population and area, as pioneers pushed the frontier of settlement west. The process finally ended around 1890 to 1912 as the last major farmlands and ranch lands were settled. Native American tribes in some places resisted militarily, but they were overwhelmed by settlers and the army, and after 1830 were relocated to reservations in the West. The highly influential frontier thesis of Wisconsin historian Frederick Jackson Turner argues that the frontier shaped the national character, with its boldness, violence, innovation, individualism, and democracy. Recent historians have emphasized the multicultural nature of the frontier. Enormous popular attention in the media focuses on the Wild West of the second half of the 19th century. As defined by Hine and Faragher, frontier history tells the story of the creation and defense of communities, the use of the land, the development of markets, and the formation of states. They explain, it is a tale of conquest, but also one of survival, persistence, and the merging of peoples and cultures that gave birth and continuing life to America. The first settlers in the West were the Spanish in New Mexico. They became U.S. citizens in 1848. The Hispanics in California, Californios, were overwhelmed by over 100,000 California gold rush miners. California grew explosively. San Francisco by 1880 had become the economic hub of the entire Pacific Coast with a diverse population of 250,000. From the early 1830s to 1869, the Oregon Trail and its many offshoots were used by over 300,000 settlers. 49ers, in the California Gold Rush, ranchers, farmers, and entrepreneurs and their families headed to California, Oregon, and other points in the far west. Wagon trains took 5 or 6 months on foot. After 1869, the trip took 6 days by rail. Manifest destiny was the belief that American settlers were destined to expand across the continent. This concept was born out of a sense of mission to redeem the old world by high example, generated by the potentialities of a new earth for building a new heaven. Manifest destiny was rejected by modernizers, especially the Whigs like Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln, who wanted to build cities and factories, not more farms. Democrats strongly favored expansion, and won the key election of 1844. After a bitter debate in Congress, the Republic of Texas was annexed in 1845, leading to war with Mexico, who considered Texas to be a part of Mexico due to the large numbers of Mexican settlers. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, broke out with the Whigs opposed to the war, and the Democrats supporting the war. The U.S. Army, using regulars and large numbers of volunteers, defeated the Mexican armies, invaded at several points, captured Mexico City and won decisively. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war in 1848. Many Democrats wanted to annex all of Mexico, but that idea was rejected by white Southerners who argued that by incorporating millions of Mexican people, mainly of mixed race, would undermine the United States as an exclusively white republic. Instead, the U.S. took Texas and the lightly settled northern parts, California and New Mexico. The Hispanic residents were given full citizenship and the Mexican Indians became American Indians. Simultaneously, gold was discovered in California in 1848, attracting over 100,000 men to Northern California in a matter of months in the California Gold Rush. To clear the state for settlers, the U.S. government began a policy of extermination since termed the California Genocide. A peaceful compromise with Britain gave the U.S. ownership of the Oregon Country, which was renamed the Oregon Territory. The demand for guano, prized as an agricultural fertilizer, led the United States to pass the Guano Islands Act in 1856, which enabled citizens of the United States to take possession, in the name of the United States, of unclaimed islands containing guano deposits. Under the act, the United States annexed nearly 100 islands in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. By 1903, 66 of these islands were recognized as territories of the United States. The central issue after 1848 was the expansion of slavery, with the anti-slavery elements in the North pitted against the pro-slavery elements that dominated the South. A small number of active Northerners were abolitionists who declared that ownership of slaves was a sin, in terms of Protestant theology, and demanded its immediate abolition. Much larger numbers in the North were against the expansion of slavery, seeking to put it on the path to extinction so that America would be committed to free land, as in low-cost farms owned and cultivated by a family, free labor, and free speech, as opposed to censorship of abolitionist material in the South. Southern white Democrats insisted that slavery was of economic, social, and cultural benefit to all whites, and even to the slaves themselves, and denounced all anti-slavery spokesmen as abolitionists. Justifications of slavery included economics, history, religion, legality, social good, and even humanitarianism. Defenders of slavery argued that the sudden end to the slave economy would have had a profound and fatal economic impact in the South, where reliance on slave labor was the foundation of their economy. They also argued that if all the slaves were freed, there would be widespread unemployment and chaos. Religious activists were split on slavery, with the Methodists and Baptists dividing into Northern and Southern denominations. In the North, the Methodists, Congregationalists, and Quakers included many abolitionists, especially among women activists. The Catholic, Episcopal, and Lutheran denominations largely ignored the slavery issue. The issue of slavery in the new territories was seemingly settled by the Compromise of 1850, brokered by Whig Henry Clay and Democrat Stephen Douglas. The compromise included the admission of California as a free state in exchange for no federal restrictions on slavery placed on Utah or New Mexico. A point of contention was the Fugitive Slave Act, which increased federal enforcement and required even free states to cooperate in turning over fugitive slaves to their owners. Abolitionists highlighted the act as particularly harmful in their fight against slavery, as evinced in the best-selling anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Compromise of 1820 was repealed in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, promoted by Senator Douglas in the name of popular sovereignty and democracy. It permitted voters to decide on the legality of slavery in each territory, and allowed Douglas to adopt neutrality on the issue of slavery. Anti-slavery forces rose in anger and alarm, forming the new Republican Party. Pro- and anti-contingents rushed to Kansas to vote slavery up or down, resulting in a miniature civil war called Bleeding Kansas. By the late 1850s, the young Republican Party dominated nearly all northern states and thus the Electoral College. It insisted that slavery would never be allowed to expand, and thus would slowly die out. The Southern slavery-based societies had become wealthy based on their cotton and other agricultural commodity production, and some particularly profited from the internal slave trade. Northern cities such as Boston and New York, and regional industries, were tied economically to slavery by banking, shipping, and manufacturing, including textile mills. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the South, nearly 8 times as many as there were nationwide in 1790. The plantations were highly profitable, due to the heavy European demand for raw cotton. Most of the profits were invested in new lands and in purchasing more slaves, largely drawn from the declining tobacco regions. For the 50 of the country's first 72 years, a slaveholder served as President of the United States and, during that period, only slaveholding presidents were re-elected to second terms. In addition, Southern states benefited by their increased apportionment in Congress due to the partial counting of slaves in their populations. There was resistance to slavery by both peaceful and violent means. Slave Rebellions, by Gabriel Prosser, 1800, Denmark Vesey, 1822, Nat Turner, 1831, and most famously by John Brown, 1859, caused fear in the white South, which imposed stricter oversight of slaves and reduced the rights of free blacks. Abolitionism grew in the North in the decades before the Civil War, while Southern states entrenched themselves on upholding slavery fiercely. Former slaves Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman became leading advocates for abolition. However, before 1860 only a minority of Northern whites supported abolition, which was often seen as a radical measure. There were violent reactions to abolitionist advocates in the North, notably the burning of an anti-slavery society in Pennsylvania Hall. With political power in Congress being a key flashpoint between slave and free states, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required the states to cooperate with slave owners when attempting to recover escaped slaves, which outraged Northerners. Formerly, an escaped slave that reached a non-slave state was presumed to have attained sanctuary and freedom under the Missouri Compromise. The Supreme Court's 1857 decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that free blacks were not citizens of the United States. The decision enraged all major political forces except for Southern states. The Republicans worried the decision could be used to expand slavery throughout all states and territories. With Senator Abraham Lincoln leading criticism of the ruling, the stage was set for the 1860 presidential election. After Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union and set up a newly formed sovereign state, the Confederate States of America, Confederacy, on February 8, 1861. It attacked Fort Sumter, a U.S. Army fort in South Carolina, thus igniting the war. When Lincoln called for troops to suppress the Confederacy in April 1861, 4 more states seceded and joined the Confederacy. A few of the northernmost slave states did not secede and became known as the border states. These were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. During the war, the northwestern portion of Virginia seceded from the Confederacy and became the new Union state of West Virginia. West Virginia is usually associated with the border states. The Civil War began April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked a U.S. military installation at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. In response, Lincoln called on the states to send troops to recapture forts, protect the capital, and preserve the Union, which in his view still existed intact despite the actions of the seceding states. The two armies had their first major clash at the First Battle of Bull Run, which proved to both sides that the war would be much longer and bloodier than originally anticipated. In the Western theater, the Union Army was relatively successful, with major battles, such as Perryville and Shiloh, along with Union Navy gunboat dominance of navigable rivers producing strategic Union victories and destroying major Confederate operations. Warfare in the Eastern theater began poorly for the Union. U.S. General George B. McClellan failed to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia in his Peninsula Campaign and retreated after attacks from Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Meanwhile, both sides concentrated in 1861 to 1862 on raising and training new armies. The main action was Union success in controlling the border states, with Confederates largely driven out of border states. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and on the notification bell so you get notified when we upload a new video. The autumn 1862 Confederate retreat at the Battle of Antietam led to Lincoln's warning he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 if the states did not return. Making slavery a central war goal energized Republicans in the North, as well as their enemies, the anti-war Copperhead Democrats, and ended the chance of British and French intervention. Lee's smaller army of Northern Virginia won battles in late 1862 and spring 1863, but he pushed too hard and ignored the Union threat in the West. Lee invaded Pennsylvania in search of supplies and to cause war weariness in the North. In perhaps the turning point of the war, Lee's army was badly beaten by the Army of the Potomac at the July 1863 Battle of Gettysburg and barely made it back to Virginia. Survivors of the Battle of Gettysburg were immediately redeployed to suppress the New York City draft riots by Irish Americans first resisting Civil War conscription but later out of racism against the city's free black population. In July 1863, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant gained control of the Mississippi River at the Battle of Vicksburg, thereby splitting the Confederacy. In 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman marched south from Chattanooga to capture Atlanta, a decisive victory that ended war jitters among Republicans in the North and helped Lincoln win re-election. On the home front, industrial expansion in the North expanded dramatically, using its extensive railroad service, and moving industrial workers into munitions factories. Foreign trade increased, with the United States providing both food and cotton to Britain, and Britain sending in manufactured products and thousands of volunteers for the Union Army, plus a few to the Confederate Army. The British operated blockade runners bringing in food, luxury items and munitions to the Confederacy, bringing out tobacco and cotton. The Union blockade increasingly shut down Confederate ports, and by late 1864 the blockade runners were usually captured before they could make more than a handful of runs. Now that we are here, this documentary will continue in part 3. See you in the next one.